We can take our seats. We'll get started with the next portion of the program. We're in for a treat with this particular part of the program. So excited to have our moderator here with us. You may have heard my brief introduction a while ago in regards to Mary Jean. Mary Jean Eisenhower, I often call her the mother of the Cherry Blossom Festival. And the reason why is that when many years ago now, too many that I'd like to remember, I was in high school, and she's being generous with the number, but I was working here at Marshfield Walmart and was having a conversation with some of my coworkers, and we were talking about a particular individual in our community who'd come in as a customer who had served in World War II, and we were having a conversation about that and about President Eisenhower, and my coworkers didn't know who President Eisenhower was. And of course, as a history nerd, that alarmed me. And they were mostly, coworkers around my age. So I just read an article about Mary Jean living in Kansas City and invited her to come to Marshfield to speak at our high school. And that blossomed into a friendship that has lasted all these many years. And during her visit, she made a comment that if you are interested in American history, you have to visit to all the different presidential libraries and birthplaces and cemeteries, that there's no central place to go to learn about everybody. Well, that kind of stayed with me, and eventually, what's more centralized in the country than Marshfield, Missouri? Here we are 21 years later. And Mary Jean is responsible for making that comment. So it's an honor every time I get to introduce her on the festival stage. Please put your hands together for our patron, our friend, and strongest supporter, Mary Jean Eisenhower.
And I'm going to put my hands together for that man. It was kind of strange to introduce Mack earlier because he's such a close friend that it's hard to talk about academics in a way. Mack is just an absolutely wonderful man, but he's recently served 8 years as the director of the not-for-profit Eisenhower Foundation in Abilene, Kansas, and I'm on the board of that. So, prior to that, he was deputy director of the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library, and he was responsible for 30 million pages of historical documents, including the Eisenhower era. His earlier assignments with the U.S. National Archives include as director of the Boston Federal Records Center and as archivist in the White House of Presidential Papers during the Nixon administration. Mack was a distinguished graduate in the Air Force ROTC at Kansas State University and served on active duty as an intelligence officer in Germany and Vietnam, where he met his beautiful wife, Inga. And let's say hello to Inga. She's been wonderful, too. He retired with the rank of Colonel USAF Reserve. That's great. He earned a BA in German, ML in librarianship, and an MA in international relations. He has served as chairman of the Abilene Convention and Visitors Bureau, as an elected member of the Abilene School Board, and as district governor of Rotary International. And in that respect, I worked for him. So he's the author of The Real Ike, Eisenhower Fact and Fiction, published by the University Press of Kansas in 2025. And as I said earlier, I don't know who all was here, but one thing about having such a dear friend write about your relative, it's a wonderful thing when you can trust them. And as an author, you have almost any liberty you want. You can say what you want and that kind of thing. And Mack did an absolute wonderful, wonderful job on this book, and we're very, very, from the whole family, we're really proud of him. So why don't you tell us about your background with the Presidential Library and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I was an Air Force brat, moved around, and some of you can probably relate to that or know people who did that. And Eisenhower had an early impact on my family, actually, because my father got an assignment to Germany, and I was 16. That because of an agreement that Eisenhower wrote with the British Prime Minister to send American munitions people to provide the atomic bombs for British bombers in Germany. And so when I was 16, I went to Germany and ended up, that's what I majored in college, because I enjoyed Germany, because I had met this young Fräulein named Ingeborg. And so thank you, Eisenhower, for that too, as well.
By proxy, he says you're welcome.
I owe him a lot. And then, as I mentioned earlier, some of you were here in the audience, lo and behold, he spoke at my college graduation at Kansas State University. And 13 years later, I was at his presidential library. So active duty in the Air Force, then continued in the reserves. But when I was in library school in Emporia, Kansas, we took a field trip to the Eisenhower Presidential Library. And I'd always thought, I'd spent time in libraries. I loved to read and so forth. And I thought a librarian would be a good career after being an Air Force intelligence person. I didn't fly, so I needed to get out. But presidential libraries, I'd never thought about that. I'd never been to Abilene, and I thought, wow, this would be great. And they offered me a job, but also the Nixon Library Project in waiting at the White House offered me a job in Washington, D.C., so I had to decide between going to Washington or going to Abilene. And the lure of the big city drew us to Washington, D.C. for 5 years. I was there during the Nixon administration. Watergate happened. I was part of the National Archives is what I was. And then, but all roads led back to Abilene. So in 1979, came back to Abilene. And we're new to town. We've only been in Abilene for 47 years. You know how that is if you're from small town America. But it is, I'm prejudiced, of course, but it is the best of the 13 existing presidential libraries, the richest collection and so forth. But my job there, I was in charge of the research room and processing the papers, the declassification that was going on, and overseeing the archive staff and doing reference service, answering questions from scholars, from journalists, and from the general public. And I was also going out and speaking to historical societies and organizations like that, elder hostels. And so I was, over my quarter century in that duty, I came across many stories about Ike, and I had my repertoire down. And I thought there's a lot to be said about this man that people don't know, and I was getting the questions that people were asking off the record and so forth. And that's the genesis of my book. Is not a biography of Ike. Those have been written. They will continue to be written. There's another one coming out next year by an esteemed historian, and that's great. I have 25 chapters that stand alone on little known things about Ike, or very well known things, or things you didn't know about and maybe shouldn't know about, but you're going to find out about anyway. And it's a scholarly book insofar as it has 480 footnotes. They're endnotes. They're at the back, so they don't disturb the flow of the book, and you can start in the middle and go back. You can pick a chapter. But it took me 5 or 6 years to write. And the biggest challenge I had, actually, Mary Jean, was that I had these stories about Eisenhower that I knew, but in order to write a book that was factual, I had to go research retroactively and find out, okay, what box and what folder title and what was the date of that article in the newspaper. You know, I had to, if I wanted accurate footnotes, I had to do research in that regard. So it was a real labor of love, but it was easy and enjoyable read, enjoyable to write. And I think if and when you ever get to read it and you're done with it, you'll like Eisenhower even more. There's a lot to be, even though all the stories aren't on initial blush favorable. But anything that's controversial about Ike, I put in the proper perspective to tell the whole story. So I think that's what I enjoy doing.
Well, it's Eisenhower fact and fiction. So I have 2 questions for you.
Okay.
First one is, what was your favorite part? What was your favorite story that you verified and
Well, one of the earliest things was where did the Ike nickname come from? You know, that was kind of a common question that we got. And the title of that chapter, I have it written, The Ike Nickname, a Most Affectionate Ethnic Slur, because it was short for Isaac. And when Eisenhower was a boy, 1890 to 1905, there were a lot of immigrants coming in through Ellis Island from Eastern Europe with names like Eisenhower that you couldn't pronounce. A lot of them were Jewish, and Ike is short for Isaac, and that was the name. But it was good natured. It was like Bubba or Doofus or whatever I don't know what they're using this day. But Ike's the nickname that stuck with him. But none of the other biographers, they always just said Eisenhower. The name was a mouthful, and so I think my book is groundbreaking in that regard. That this is the true origin of the nickname. So.
Well, I just learned something.
And it's well footnoted too. So.
Just kidding.
But Ike the pilot too. You know, Eisenhower. This is an interesting story. He met. Of course, he grew up in an all-boy home, just brothers, no sisters. And then he joined the Army, went to West Point, an all-boys school at the time, all-male school. His first assignment's at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, and he meets this 19-year-old, fluffy, beautiful girl in pink named Mamie Geneva Dowd, Mary Jean's grandmother. And he was 25, she was 19. He was smitten. A short courtship. He asked for her hand in marriage. He did the proper thing, went to Mr. Dowd and asked for permission to marry your daughter, and then also shared the good news that he had been accepted in the fledgling Army Air Corps because he always wanted to be a pilot, plus there was 50% hazardous duty pay. And Mr. Dowd said, young man, I would be so glad to have you in the family, but not if you're a pilot, because I don't want a young widow on my hands. So think about that. So Ike deliberated on it for 24 hours, came back and decided to stick with the infantry and forego being a pilot, although in 1938 in the Philippines, he got his private pilot's license and had 180 hours. He's one of 3 presidents that are pilots. You know the other 2? The Bush boys. You know, they're both military pilots, and Ike had 180 hours, and so he was one of 3 pilots. But think of it, if he had gone into the Army Air Corps in 1916, 1917, he would have made a 2-star, 3-star general in the Army Air Corps and during the war, but he wouldn't have been in charge of D-Day, the landings. That was an infantry officer's job. He wouldn't have been the president, or he wouldn't have been president of the United States. He wouldn't have been the national hero. He would have been a footnote in World War II history. So we have a debt of gratitude that we owe Mr. Dowd, I think.
And I wouldn't be here either.
Even more importantly, Mary Jean would be.
Well, it's interesting that you said the name Ike and where it came from, because in I guess I was about 11, and I came to him from school, and I asked him, I heard that your name is really David Eisenhower, not Dwight Eisenhower. How come? And he said, well, he got tired of being called Bud. And so he took on Dwight when he went into West Point. And they never really officially changed it either.
Well, he was, I think when the name in the Bible, in the home, there's no birth certificate for Dwight D. Eisenhower. We can't prove he's ever been born, actually. It's in the family Bible in the living room of the boy at home. He was. Yeah, we know that. He has a presidential library, for Pete's sake. But in the family Bible, originally it was going to be David Dwight.
Right.
But the father's name was David, and so they changed it to Dwight David. And so that's an interesting footnote to history. And he was born in Texas. All of his brothers were born in Dickinson County, and right around Abilene. But his brothers called him the Texas Renegade. But he moved back to Kansas. His 2 older brothers born in Kansas. The family went to Texas briefly, came back when Ike was about a year old, and his 2 younger brothers were then born there too. So, but yeah, he was Abilene was definitely his home.
Well, what was the most, shall we say, poignant thing that you had to write about or research?
Well, you know, interesting, he talked about the importance of youth to him. He was really concerned about America's youth as leading these soldiers into battle, and his famous words about any man who earns acclaim in the blood of his followers has to be very humbled, and that's the way he was. But he was concerned about the physical fitness of youth, and he created the Presidential Office of Physical Fitness in 1955. That still is around. It's now the physical fitness, it's youth physical fitness and nutrition. Nutrition has been added here recently, which is probably a good thing too. But so he was, and there's a famous quote. He wrote a letter in Reader's Digest addressed to America's youth and finished it urging them to live up to the country and to straighten your elders out if necessary. But I, for one, have confidence in you, he told the youth. So that was pretty. And he told at our graduation in Manhattan, Kansas, in 1966, he said, I was a member of the finest generation, not the greatest. The greatest won the war. We were merely the finest. He had to come up with another adjective, I guess. Maybe after that it was a pretty good generation. But anyway, and he told us not to be misled by the kooks and the beatniks and who are taking up so much time in the media. He was already concerned about the media, leading the youth astray. So he was ahead of his time in so many ways. And I probably should finish this with this, but in 1965, 4 years before he died, 3.5 years before he died, he took out a yellow pad of paper, lined paper, up in Gettysburg in the office and wrote down his predictions for the year 2000. Oh. And my book is the first place it's been published because I think the other historians just didn't find it. It's been available, but it's in the post-presidential papers and box one of the post-presidential files, and so people didn't go there. But he made predictions, talked about how Europe will be unified and Russia will be even drawn to the West. So, okay. And China will be a menace, but not that important. Okay. Africa will still be struggling with getting their house in order in their country. And then he said, on a more technological note, said individuals will have walkie-talkie type devices that they can carry around on their person and have conversations with friends up to a mile in distance. We call those cell phones today. He said we're gonna have. He probably had the Dick Tracy watch, I think, back then. I'm not sure, but so that was kind of a humorous thing.
Yeah, Dick Tracy was actually ahead of his time too.
Yeah. Yeah. Ike and the Atomic Bomb is one of the chapters. It's interesting. In World War II, he was in the European theater, of course, and after the war, he was with the occupation. And the war secretary came over, Stimson, and was touring and said, let Ike know for the first time, this was in late July, that America had developed something called an atomic bomb and that it was going to be dropped on Japan in the next week or so. Ike was kind of shocked, flabbergasted. His initial reaction was negative, like, wow, don't we already pretty much have that war won? And he said, I hate to be the first country to use it, in war. But it's interesting, and he also noted, if the Nazis had that and dropped one at the Normandy landings, the French would be speaking German today. It was But fast forward to 1953 when he's president, the Korean War is still dragging on. The armistice negotiations are going on and on. He let the word slip out that all weapons are on the table, including nuclear weapons. And negotiations finished up quickly, and there was peace within 6 months after he was president. And then as president, he relied on nuclear weapons as much as he despised them and feared them. But that allowed him to have a smaller peacetime army, which was he was more concerned with America being bankrupt by military spending. And he said, if we can have a serious, believable threat that we would use nuclear weapons, we can save billions and billions of dollars in defense funding and save our country from bankruptcy. And so he had the credibility to carry that out. And he said, at some point there's going to be somebody sitting behind this desk who's not going to have that, and that's going to be kind of a sad thing for the country.
Interesting. We could almost apply it now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you have a favorite chapter?
Well, I think, yeah, I want to get the title exactly correct. It's A Natural Curiosity, How Ike Invented the Internet and Other Neat Scientific Stuff.
It wasn't Al Gore.
See? It was what?
It wasn't Al Gore.
Yeah, it wasn't Al Gore. Eisenhower, he claims to have grown up on a farm. Well, they had 3.5 acres, but it was in a farm community. He worked on a farm as a kid, and if anybody has a farm background, you're always repairing equipment. You know, you're mechanically inclined whether you wanted to be or not. And then he goes off, and he did some cold riveting, and then he worked at the Bell Springs Creamery in Abilene, hauling 300 or 500 pound blocks of ice with pulleys and levers, and so he knew the physics. Then he goes to West Point, and your major at West Point, you could do engineering. He picked engineering, got an engineering degree. It's not like mechanical engineering in this day and age, but it was still, he was having trigonometry and higher mathematics and chemistry and physics and so forth, and mechanical drawing. Mechanical drawing, by the way, allowed him to become a very nice amateur artist later in life. You know, Ike Van Gogh is one of the other chapters. But so and then in the First World War, he didn't get to Europe. He thought his career was over because he missed the war, and thought, well, you have to have fought in the war to get promoted. What he was doing stateside in Camp Colt, right outside of Gettysburg, where the family ended up retiring, he was training the fledgling tank corps, America's most modern weapon. So he was involved in the cutting edge there. And then he gets a pilot's license in the Philippines before the war. So he was he was always enamored about scientific things. He started the Office of Science Advisor in the White House. He started that during his years in the White House, and it still exists to this day. There's this great, I've seen a movie clip where he was getting a tour of the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. Has anybody seen the Liberty Bell? You know, it's not that huge, but the park ranger was giving a tour, but he walks up to it first and with both hands rubs it, then steps back and listens to the briefing. But you know, he just had to have a hands-on. He was into the physical and just nature. You know, the curiosity was there in him, and so that was probably the most interesting chapter that I had to write. I had to do a lot of research on that too. And
That's interesting. You know, you keep mentioning that he had a pilot's license. He did not have a driver's license until he was, 74, I think?
And there was a story about he didn't know how to dial the phone because he had, you know, as a general officer and as a two-term president, he'd always just picked up the phone and tell the operator, "Get me the Secretary of Treasurer." Or something like that, you know.
Well, there was kind of a funny story. He was the most recognizable driver in Gettysburg, age 74, and he had a little bit of military lead in his foot. And he would just go flying through town. Everybody would say, "Here he comes," you know. They'd kind of, and finally one day we were all at the farm, and the Secret Service let the chief of police in, and you know, they had a little powwow in what I call Granddad's man cave. It was the one room of the house that he had that he could. Be himself. He had Western saddles in there and all that stuff. Anyway, he came out, you know, he gave him tea and all that stuff, and they had some kind of private conversation. He comes out and he says, he thinks I need to find a different hobby than driving. So he relinquished his driver's license. Oh. But he could fly.
Yeah, but he could fly. And he always, the story was when he was interviewed a couple of his pilots on Air Force One, and they would say he'd always come up to the cockpit when he had time and sit in the co-pilot seat and they'd let him think he was flying. I mean, he had the stick, but he, and
Oh,
because
they were pretending?
yeah,
Oh.
well, I mean, they were. It was probably an automatic pilot. I don't know, but but they were sort of over here trying to make sure. But he was. Yeah,
That's
I mean,
hilarious.
he had skill.
Because on the first Air Force,
Oh.
on the one Air Force One, I watched him fly it. So they were pretending, huh?
And yeah, right.
That's great.
And speaking of that, of course, he created the Federal Aviation Agency. So that's his legacy for flying. They're still using the same computers, apparently. That. But there is an upgrade in progress. But also, he wasn't responsible for this directly, but his airplane, the presidential airplane, was flying back east in 1953 during his first year and had a near collision with an Eastern Airlines plane because they both had the same flight number. And so after that, the presidential plane became Air Force One. So he gave us Air Force One.
First Air Force One, that's
First
right.
Air Force One.
And it's being restored, by the way, a little plug here.
Yeah.
And I'm on the board. If you guys, want to send $25 to see the thing.
To the Columbine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Columbine. That's the one that I thought I saw him flying.
Good prop plane. He might have been flying the prop plane. I don't know. Maybe just not the jet. But you have some firsthand experience with your father's barbecuing experiences. There was a story out there that says he would throw the steaks right on the charcoal. Is there any
Yeah,
validity to that?
he didn't have the rung. He just threw it directly on the steaks, which made it really charry and wonderful on the outside and, nice and right on the inside. Yeah, he did.
Clean it off with a
And
steel brush.
he had his own rub and the whole bit.
Everybody got extra fiber that day, But he was a cook. He was a real. There's a chapter on Ike the Cook because he grew up in an all-boy household, and he always volunteered to cook for his mother and enjoyed it. He was always interested in the herbs from the garden and the recipes. And when he went on a camping trip with his boyhood friends down the river, the Smoky Hill River, he was a designated cook because he was good at it. And it got you out of fetching firewood and cleaning up the camp and putting up the tent and other chores like that. But it was a lifelong thing. His first military assignment as an infantry officer in San Antonio, he went to cooks and bakers school for what the heck was that all? He said, we're not paying our soldiers anything, but they at least deserve 3 good meals a day. And so he was serious about that. And when he was out visiting Army posts throughout his whole career, he would always stop at the mess hall and if the mess sergeant said, look how shiny those pots are. Well, I want to know how good the food tastes. And he was always taking the lid off, you need a little more salt in this one or whatever. And when he was walking out of maybe he'd give a speech in a hotel, and then he would be walked out through the kitchen for security reasons. He would stop in the kitchen and talk to the cooks, and say, well, hey, just take the lid off and see what they were doing. So he had a love for food. And I think it was the historian up at Gettysburg College said what he enjoyed doing for a hobby was he liked to go to the butcher shop and just talk to the butcher about the cuts of meat. How's that for a hobby?
Yeah, he hung his own meat at the farm.
Yeah, raised beef.
And I'm sure he loved the cooking because Mimi did not cook.
Oh yeah, that's another story. He met Mimi, your grandmother, a lovely, lovely lady. Her mother told her, don't learn to cook, otherwise you'll be tied to the kitchen for the rest of your life. And she took it to heart.
She could boil an egg at the end, but
Yeah. She could make mayonnaise and fudge when they got married, and so, but it was interesting. Ike and religion is another thing. We just had a great program here earlier about Jimmy Carter's Bible study and so forth. The Reverend Billy Graham was asked, who's the most religious president you knew? And he knew them all from Eisenhower up to Donald Trump, first term. And you'd think, he probably said, he would probably talk about, Jimmy Carter. No, he said Dwight D. Eisenhower. And here was a man, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who, of course, he read the Bible twice as a child. They had family readings on Sunday afternoons, and he had the watch to prove that he had read the Bible, read it twice. He knew his religion back and forth, the Bible back and forth. But he went off to West Point, and at West Point, cadets had to go to chapel. Chapel was mandatory. But when he graduated from West Point, he didn't make it a practice really of darkening the doors of a church, except maybe for weddings and funerals and so forth. But fast forward, after he was elected president, he joined the Presbyterian Church, Mamie's Church, and he got baptized for the first time at age 62. But yet Billy Graham said he was the most religious president he knew. And there's some evidence to that. This is a different story. There's a chapter that I call Move Over Richard Nixon. It's Dwight D. Eisenhower's office recordings. Did you know about this? Ike recorded conversations in the Oval Office. If only Richard Nixon had known that, he could have, wouldn't that have made things easier for him? It wasn't very good. It was just for a couple of years, and it was dictaphone. If you've ever heard of the dictaphone, those are those wax-like bells. They were meant for dictation, but there's some evidence. And the library didn't know we had any. We didn't have recordings. We had dictabelts. But eventually we discovered we had those. I had to fly these dictabelts. We didn't know what was on them, but we suspected that they were conversations. I flew them to Melbourne, Florida, for Dictaphone Corporation to play on their equipment because it's an antique piece of machinery. But sure enough, he did record some conversations. And then, but wait, there's more. He recorded conversations when he was president of Columbia University up in New York City. And there's some conversations that we have of that. And there's also indications that he recorded conversations at NATO headquarters in Paris. And I've listened to all these conversations. The quality's poor. But one thing that came through and the conversations are not important historically. There was no significant event or meeting or personage it was one-on-one conversations the president was having in the Oval Office or in his office at Columbia. But in every single conversation, Ike was quoting scripture. He'd said something, about this prophet, or, and Ezekiel said that, and it was just, and his personal secretary, Ann Whitman, who was outside his Oval Office for 8 years, said the most surprising thing to her about President Eisenhower was his religion, his knowledge of the Bible. So that's what blew her away. So it's kind of ironic, but Billy Graham's a pretty good source when you talk about who's the most religious president. So.
That is kind of amazing. I think he might have gotten a lot of that from Ida because she felt the need for education, Ida being his mother. And her grandfather, who she went to live with, she was orphaned early, told her to just knock off the education and just be a little Southern Belle or whatever. And she didn't want to hear anything about it. And she wanted her education, so she memorized 17,000 Bible verses to prove that she was worthy of education. So I imagine he picked up a little bit from her too.
There's also another object in the museum holdings, which I know that you've seen, the Emmy Award. You've seen Ike's Emmy?
Oh.
Ike received an Emmy Award from the TV Producers of America in 1955. Not because he was a great actor or anything like that, but he brought the modern presidential press conference into the modern era. Before Ike's time in the White House, presidential press conferences were off the record. Media could be in there with their pencils, but they weren't filmed. And if you wanted to quote something the president said, you actually had to get permission from the White House. Think of that. Think of how it's changed now. But he had a press conference every 2 weeks on average, 24, 25 a year. So that's what that works out to be. So he was communicating with the public and was very open about it and thought the people deserved to know, So, and he took responsibility for speaking about what the government was doing. So, but here's the other thing. So he got word that, he was going to receive an Emmy. And the people from Hollywood wanted him to come out there to accept it, have a little ceremony and everything, and he was too busy for that, not interested in that. Then they said, well, we can come to Washington and present it at the White House. That's not convenient either. No. So they had to fly it out to a Philadelphia TV station, which then drove it out to Gettysburg College and gave it to his assistant press secretary, who then took it to the White House. And thank you very much. But there wasn't an ego thing for him. It was just something that was right to do. So he was just, but it's in the presidential library. So there you go.
So what do you think would surprise your readers?
I think just the human nature of him. He was there's a Yiddish term, he was a real mensch. I mean, and he loved people. He was a man's man. He liked playing cards, playing bridge and he always wanted the best bridge partner. And there's this picture of him, I don't know if he's playing canasta, or not canasta, maybe Scrabble with your grandmother on the porch, Gettysburg.
Yeah, oh, sure.
He's got such a frown on his face. He's so frustrated with his wife that, Or,
She was pretty much a sharp card too.
Yeah.
Or, yeah, whatever.
But yeah, he was very, very competitive. Very competitive. There's the famous tree at Augusta National that he kept slicing into, or maybe it was chip. And he asked them if they couldn't cut it down because it was affecting his score.
He was sitting president when he did that too.
He was president. They said, "Sir, you're president of the United States, but we're in charge of the country club." No, the tree died a few years ago, and now there's a piece of it at the Eisenhower Presidential Library. I mean,
Augusta sent it
with a story and outline, but he had no power when it came to Augusta. Although Mamie had a cabin, didn't she?
She did, yeah.
So, yeah, he loved it. It was a good respite there.
I think my Barbie doll's still in the crawl space of that cabin.
Okay.
But that's a different story.
Yeah.
So, do you have a most important chapter?
Well, there's a question that comes up all the time, and I'm reluctant to bring it up, but that's about an alleged affair. Has anybody heard about that? I hope one person knows. The rest of you are all innocent. Okay, good. I'm glad. No, and that's actually the longest chapter in the book, and I think it's the most authoritative description of this. His wartime driver, Irish-born driver, Kay Summersby, was 18 years younger, was with him through England and then North Africa, and became a part of the Schaeff family. And but I've analyzed, I've examined what all the historians have said, what other journalists have said. I've talked to Kay Summersby, the executive of her estate, her nephew by email, her brother's. He was in England. I've communicated with him. I've gotten documentation from Kay Summersby's brother, who tried to stop public. Kay Summersby wrote 2 books. The first book was Eisenhower Was My Boss, and it was, oh golly gee, I drove Eisenhower, what a great man, and that was in 1948, I think. And then this other book that she wrote was published on her deathbed. In fact, it was published a couple years after she died, and it was ghostwritten. And they embellished the story, to sell copies. And so it was, and I document that. Yeah, because it was, everybody who knew Ike and knew that, and I surveyed my archive staff, the archivist and archives technician who'd worked with the Eisenhower records for 20 years, about their assessment of it. And they said, probably not. It's hard to prove that something didn't happen, but all indications, just what everybody knew, and the people that were around, Ike didn't have a free moment anyway. If like there's a picture of Kay Summersby and Ike having picnic by the side of the road. Well, somebody took the picture. Somebody was driving the Jeep. There was a Jeep with a machine gun that was following them. Things like that didn't happen. I think the stories are severely discounted, and I think that's probably that. Unfortunately, it has entered the lore of presidential picadillos, which it shouldn't. And so I think this book I seriously discount it, and I think that this should be the record from now on.
Well, I remember when I was a kid, he was, I forget who it was that he was trying to decide whether or not to nominate him for something, you know, I just remember the story. And he said to my father, no, I don't think we can because he cheats on his wife. And he felt like that was a proven dishonesty.
He was a prude. I mean, he didn't, he couldn't abide a dirty joke. You know, he would, so he'd been in the Army, and so he knew how to say hell and damn. I'm sorry, anybody, if I offend anybody here, but nobody else knew that because it was in private company. He didn't do it in public, and he would be aghast at the kind of conversation that comes on now, you know, in public. And
Oh, yeah.
the profanity that is going around in the public. So he was, yeah.
Yeah, on TV no less. I mean, it's really a different world.
And, you know, I think when the president left office, he was the 34th president, and there was a presidential survey done by a political scientist who ranked presidents 1 through 34, and Ike was number 22. He was at the top of the below average presidents. And Ike was kind of, he was hurt, he was offended, he was angry when that report came out a couple years after he left office, and he said, 8 years of peace and prosperity, by golly, it didn't just happen, you know. But he made the presidency look easy. After D-Day, you know, things were easy, but and we think of him as this grandfatherly type president. He was 62 when he was elected. That's not that old anymore. I mean, you know, 72 when he left office. But by today's standards, that's not an old president. But yeah, he was. But the Eisenhower Library, I played a little role in this. We opened these papers out in the archives. Not just the papers of Eisenhower, but 500 other people who worked with him. We have 500 personal paper collections of White House staff, cabinet members, sub-cabinet, anybody that had a connection with Eisenhower. We would solicit their papers, and they would send them to the library. And after researchers started examining this thing, they realized, oh, yeah, Eisenhower was in charge. Eisenhower did. He made it look easy, and so he's now ranked number 5. Gone from 22 to number 5. He's among the great presidents, just right below, you know, Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and so forth. He's almost Mount Rushmore worthy, I think. In fact, the cover of my book was, I had an initial draft, and I was going to have a Mount Rushmore with Ike's image sort of hovering over Mount Rushmore, but the University Press of Kansas didn't like that one, so I didn't. But maybe it was premature, but maybe it could still happen, you know. So.
That's good. So I get this question a lot, and it's probably better coming from you. What do you think of what Granddad would think of today's politics?
Yeah, and I think maybe it was even your father said, I would not have the temerity to guess what my father would say about blah, blah, but I'll give it a shot myself.
Sure.
Now, I think he would be totally offended by the language, the animosity and the lack of working across party lines, and just the general tenor of what's going on, the hate-filled rhetoric, and the name-calling. But that said, he would probably agree with much of the foreign policy of the current administration and a lot of the economic policy. And the things he disagreed with, here's the thing about Eisenhower. There's one president at a time. He's got all the information, and politics stops at the water's edge. You do not criticize the current incumbent if you're a former president. And he was very upset with LBJ about the conduct of the Vietnam War because Eisenhower's feeling was, you helped get us into this thing, now let's end it mercifully. That's the best thing we can do for everybody involved, Vietnamese and American. And he got frustrated with LBJ, stopped calling him on the phone, but he never said anything publicly. Maybe he did on the golf course, but he would not have criticized JFK or LBJ, because presidents don't criticize their successors, and I think that's a class act. So.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, absolutely. Well, are there any questions that we would like to? Yes.
I'm from around Lebanon, Missouri, and the stretch of interstate there is supposed to be the first designated interstate. I was wondering if you had any comment on the interstate system and his influence on it.
He talks about the first stretch of interstate somewhere in Missouri. We claim we have it in Kansas, too, so I don't know. Right outside of Abilene, right? No, it's by Topeka. But yes, the interstate highway system, that's one of Ike's legacies. You probably know the story. He did the transcontinental convoy. In 1919, the Army sent several hundred men and their equipment across from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. It took 100 days for them to get across. They had to build bridges. Once you got west of Ohio, there were no paved roads, so they were, and that was the mental note he made. And then he goes to Germany during World War II and sees, when he enters Germany in 1945, the Autobahn. The Autobahn was already built. That had been built in the 30s. Why the heck don't we have something like this in the United States of America? And so one of the first things he wanted to do was build an interstate highway system. And now it has over 40,000 miles, and it's called the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System, which is due. And that was legislation that he signed, and he got it. It's the largest public works project in American history, I think. But yeah, it's one of his lasting legacies. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the original funding just expired like last year. He had it funded all the way up, I believe, and then, I don't know.
And he brought us into the space age, too. He launched the first, he created NASA. Eisenhower created NASA, started the astronaut program. The first astronauts were under his administration. First satellites were launched were under his administration. I had this little thing going with the Kennedy Library. They wanted to take credit for Kennedy got us into space, got us to the moon, or started it, and Ike got us into the Vietnam War with sending advisors. I jokingly said, okay, we'll take some blame for Vietnam, which isn't true, but if you give Ike credit for the space race, and they never took the deal, so but it was, but Eisenhower is the father of the American space program.
That's right, 1960 in Huntsville, Alabama, right? That's where NASA started. Yes. Yes.
And you were too young to be a voter or anything. It just doesn't make any sense, does it? But maybe so your parents would vote for Ike. No, that's, hey, he didn't mind hugging.
He was with my grandfather because my grandfather was a Republican politician and
Okay.
was like his local escort. So I don't know if my grandfather put him up to where, but
Yeah.
right there.
That's a neat story. He announced for president in June of 1952 and was elected in November. So that's 6 months of campaigning. Can you imagine that? Usually it's 2 years now.
Wouldn't
isn't
that be heavenly?
Yeah.
We're starting on 28 already.
Well, we'll have to write the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, and they have an audiovisual archivist who would be glad to try to find that. If you have an approximate date in St. Louis, they can look it up. Okay. scan that or Xerox that and send it too. There's a question. Mary Jean, you want to ask?
Yes.
I'm interested because I remember seeing President Eisenhower over the years, and they always refer to the Eisenhower jacket. Did he
Oh.
change that in the military, the shorter coat as opposed to the longer coat?
He didn't like the tails. Yes.
Was that it?
Yeah. And for a while there, in the 70s, I think they,
They've gone back to it. They've gone
yeah,
back to it now.
it was a fashion statement. You know, lots
And-
of
and
people had
actually-
Eisenhower jackets.
And when he got over there to England in 1942, the British officers looked a little snappier than the Americans. And so he had a tailor do some work and developed what became known as the Ike jacket. It was a knockoff of the British jacket, too. So we have to give the British a little bit of credit there. But now it's made a comeback, too. So, yeah.
I've always heard the story that he loved case pocket knives and would give a pocket knife as a memento to people, special guests that would come to the White House. Is there any record of that? That you know of?
I don't know of one, but that sounds like one of his moves. I mean, it sounds like something he'd do.
That,
They ended up naming the pattern the Eisenhower because he bought
Oh.
so many.
that's a neat story. I must confess that I haven't heard that, but it sounds plausible, and I bet the museum would have some information about that too. So, wow, neat.
We have time for one more. Yes.
Richard Norton Smith, who directed something like 5 Republican presidential libraries, did a biography of Thomas E. Dewey, and even Dewey's son didn't know where the Dewey papers were. He finally found them in Rochester, New York, which had no connection to Dewey. He had been born in Michigan and was governor of New York. Is there much discussion at presidential libraries that when people donated their papers, the libraries urge the candidate who ran against either the primary or general election to have those papers donated so that people going to do research can see a timeline and can see a he said comparison?
That sounds like a logical thing to consider, but usually the people that have run for president against the ultimate winner have an ego of their own, have an alma mater that wants their papers, and has a state historical society that wants their papers, and maybe their legacy will continue afterwards. But yeah, I think there's a whole campaign series in the Eisenhower records at the library about the campaign. So, but I think, by the way, the future presidential libraries they're probably no longer going to be part of the National Archives, starting with Barack Obama, because of the expense. The museum's going to be private in Chicago, for example, and with Trump in Miami area, Florida. The papers will be, which maybe are all digital anyway, are going to be in the National Archives in actually College Park, Maryland, which is that's a sad state of affairs because presidential libraries are a great gift to the country. So the whole world feels that way. Foreign researchers at the Eisenhower Library loved coming because our records were open sooner than theirs were.
In going to all 13 presidential libraries, you then find you have to look for Mitchell, South Dakota, to find somebody named George McGovern.
Mhm.
And if his papers had been at the Nixon Library, it would have been a lot easier. You could fly to Los Angeles more easily than you can to Mitchell.
Well, and there's a reason presidential libraries are no longer in West Branch, Iowa, Abilene, Kansas, and Independence, Missouri. They're on a college campus or in a big city because the researchers needed to get there, so which is good and bad. They're not centered around the boy at home anymore.
Well, we really appreciate it. And, yeah, sorry. And I'm afraid our time's up.
Oh, this has been wonderful, Mary Jean. We'll
has
we'll
been
continue it
wonderful.
back in Abilene, okay?
It sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. God bless.